Hey guys, tonight we're heading back, way back, to a time of mud and misery, castles and crowns, and some truly, astonishingly awful people on the throne. We're talking about the most terrible kings in medieval history. You'll feel the chill of stone walls and the dampness of a drafty hall. Hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and maybe even catch a whiff of, well, let's just say medieval perfume was mostly a suggestion. You'll be glad you're not there. This isn't just about battles and beheadings. It's about the kind of terrible that makes you want to pull the covers up to your chin. Because you'll realize just how good you have it now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our first stop is a dank, gray stretch of English history. A place where a king's greed became a national disaster. Close your eyes and imagine yourself a peasant farmer. Your hands calloused and your back aching from a day spent tilling a cold. In cooperative field, you trudge back to your wattle and daub hut. The smoke from your meager fire a welcome wisp on the evening air. But even here, in the quiet of your home, the shadow of the king looms large. This is the world of King John of England. A man whose reign was a masterclass in how to alienate everyone. Everywhere, all at once. You see, John was not exactly a people person. He was, to put it mildly, a bit of a jerk. Historians still argue whether his cruelty was a genuine personality flaw or just a byproduct of his desperate insecurity. He had a chip on his shoulder the size of the White Cliffs of Dover. Remember his older brother, Richard the Lionheart? The hero, the crusader, the one who rode off to glory? Well, John was the spare, and when he finally got the throne, he was determined to prove himself. But he went about it in all the wrong ways. His greatest talent, it seems, was taxation. Oh, he was a virtuoso of finding new and creative ways to squeeze money out of his subjects. We're not talking about a little tax here and there. He invented taxes for almost everything. There was the scutage tax, a payment from knights in lieu of military service. Fine, sounds reasonable, but then he started demanding it way more often than necessary. Then he added a forest tax, a land tax, a tax on inheritances. Basically, if you had it, John wanted a piece of it. It was like he was playing a medieval version of Monopoly with real people's lives. And he had a permanent chance card that just said, pay the bank. It's an economic truism that a king can tax you right into a rebellion. John was putting that theory to the ultimate test. He was also notoriously bad with money. A fringe historical tidbit, often overlooked, is that John was obsessed with building a new, enormous treasury at a place called Old Sarum. He was so paranoid about his money being stolen that he had a massive, fortified chamber built, and he'd spend hours there, just counting his coins. It's almost comical. This image of the most powerful man in the kingdom hunched over a pile of groats. While his realm was teetering on the edge of financial collapse, he was also a bad military strategist. He lost Normandy and most of his French possessions, a monumental failure that earned him the nickname Softsword from his enemies. So, he was bad at war, bad with money, and bad with people. What's a king to do? Squeeze harder, of course. The breaking point came with the barons. These were the most powerful nobles in the land, and they were tired of John's relentless demands and arbitrary punishments. You can just picture it. A group of them sitting around a crackling fire in a cold stone hall. Their beards bristling with indignation, muttering about how this king was an utter disaster. It's almost a scene from a bad sitcom. And then he demanded another tax for the third time this month, one would exclaim. He even fined me for being late to court. Another would add, they were pushed too far. And their collective frustration finally boiled over. They demanded reform, they demanded rights, and they made him sign a document at a muddy field called Runnymede. This document, of course, was the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta wasn't some grand declaration of human rights. At least not at first. It was a list of grievances from the barons. A demand for the king to follow the law and stop acting like a toddler with a crown. But this act, this single moment of a group of powerful men telling the king, no, was a huge deal. It established the principle that even a king is not above the law. It's a fact that you'll see in every history book. A moment that truly changed the course of English law and, eventually, the world. It all started with a king who was just really bad at his job. So, you're a medieval baron, and you've just forced the most unpopular man in the kingdom to sign a document that limits his power. You've got this incredible, groundbreaking piece of parchment, and you think, great, this is the start of a new, more peaceful era. Wrong. King John died just a year later. But the legacy of his financial mismanagement and constant political strife lived on, like a bad smell lingering in the royal halls. But history, in its magnificent, meandering way, had another kind of terrible king waiting in the wings. This time, it wasn't a terrible king because he was cruel or greedy, but because he was, well, he just wasn't there. Let's fast forward a couple of centuries. The mud is still there. The castles are a little grander, but the air of political intrigue is thicker than ever. Imagine you're a high-ranking noble in the 15th century, a time of grand titles and even grander family feuds. You attend court, but when you look at the throne, you don't see a fearsome monarch. You see a man who seems to be in a world of his own. You're in the court of Henry VI, a king who was, for all intents and purposes, a gentle and pious soul. And that was the problem. Henry was the King of England, but he was also a man who suffered from a profound and debilitating mental illness. He would often fall into catatonic states, unable to speak, move, or recognize anyone, including his own wife and son. Historians still argue whether his affliction was a severe form of schizophrenia or a hereditary condition. What we know for sure is that for a king, someone whose very identity is tied to action and decision, this was a political vacuum of epic proportions. It was like the CEO of a massive company suddenly deciding to spend all day staring at a wall. The company, inevitably, would fall apart. And it did. You see, the great thing about an evil king like John is that at least he's predictable in his awfulness. You know what he wants: more of your money. A king who is mentally absent, however, creates a power struggle. Everyone starts to jockey for position. And the people around him, his wife, the queen, and various ambitious nobles, begin to make decisions on his behalf. The court of Henry VI became a real-life Game of Thrones, with the king as the ultimate, unmoving prize. The most notorious example of this was when Henry's cousin, Richard, Duke of York, became protector of the realm during one of the king's long periods of incapacity. He essentially took over the government. But then, to everyone's surprise, Henry would briefly regain his faculties. He'd wake up, look around, and go, "Wait, what? Richard, you're in charge now? No, I'm the king," and he would undo all of Richard's work. This back and forth, this constant cycle of a king being present and then not, drove the entire kingdom to the brink. It's a fantastic example of a fringe historical tidbit that perfectly encapsulates a major crisis. In one instance, Henry's return to lucidity was so abrupt that he was found humming to himself and asking to see his baby son, whom he had never met, because he had been in a catatonic state since the boy's birth. Imagine the awkward family reunion. This isn't just a quirky story. It's the spark that lit the fuse of one of England's bloodiest conflicts, the Wars of the Roses. The struggle between the House of Lancaster, Henry's family, and the House of York, Richard's family, was born out of this royal vacuum. The Red Rose of Lancaster against the White Rose of York, a conflict named centuries later, of course, was a brutal, decades-long civil war. So, while King John's reign was a bad episode of a show, Henry VI's was a multi-season saga of royal dysfunction. A cruel king is one thing. A king who cannot rule at all is another. You can't rally against a man who is lost in his own mind. You can't negotiate with a king who doesn't even know you're there. His reign was a masterclass in how a leader's passivity and inability to lead can be more destructive than an active tyranny. The kingdom needed a strong hand, and instead, it had a kind, gentle, but utterly lost man who wanted nothing more than to pray and found a new school, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, which he actually did. A truly bizarre mix of piety and political catastrophe. It's a gentle kind of terrible, but a terrible king nonetheless. And so, as you're trying to wrap your head around a king who was too gentle for his own good, the Wars of the Roses rage on. It's a messy, confusing period of history, a real-life family feud with swords and castles. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York are clashing all over the place. And it's into this chaotic mess that our next subject emerges. He's a name you've definitely heard, but maybe not in the way you're about to hear it now. Put on your softest pajamas, and let's get into the story of Richard III. You see, Richard's reputation is almost entirely defined by one person, William Shakespeare. The playwright painted him as a grotesque, hunchbacked monster who murdered his way to the throne. You can almost hear Shakespeare whispering, "And for my next trick, I will make this king the ultimate villain for all time." While a great play, this is what historians still argue about, whether Richard III was truly a villain or a victim of Tudor propaganda. Let's look at the facts. Richard was the Duke of Gloucester, brother to King Edward IV. He was a loyal and capable military commander. When Edward died, he left behind two young sons, the Princes Edward and Richard, who were next in line for the throne. Now, here's where the story gets really murky. Richard took the boys into his protection, ostensibly for their safety, and housed them in the Tower of London. But then, to the shock of everyone, he had himself declared king, and the princes simply disappeared. You're a commoner in London, hearing whispers about this. Maybe you're a baker, wiping flour from your hands as you listen to the news. The princes? What happened to the princes, you ask? No one knows for sure. They were never seen again. The mainstream historical fact is that their disappearance allowed Richard to seize the crown. The common belief at the time, and ever since, was that Richard had them murdered. The Tudors, who defeated Richard and took the throne, were more than happy to spread this narrative far and wide. But what if Richard was innocent? What if the princes died of a disease, or were murdered by someone else? This is the fringe tidbit that gets modern historians excited. Some argue that Henry VII, the first Tudor king, had them killed to secure his own claim. He certainly had a motive. The bones of two children were found in the Tower of London centuries later, but it's never been conclusively proven they belonged to the princes. This mystery, this enduring scholarly debate, is what makes Richard III such a compelling figure. Was he a monster, or a misunderstood man caught in a terrible web of political intrigue? Regardless of his guilt or innocence in that specific crime, Richard's reign was short and brutally unpopular. He was only king for a little over 2 years. The reason he's on our list of terrible kings is because of the sheer ruthlessness and instability his rise to power represented. He took the throne from his own nephews, a move so audacious it shook the very foundations of royal succession. He then had to fight a constant stream of rebellions, led by disgruntled nobles and a certain Henry Tudor, who was living in exile and biding his time. Imagine the atmosphere in the court. Everyone is on edge. You don't know who to trust. The man on the throne took it by force, and he's constantly looking over his shoulder. The civil war that Henry VI's madness started, Richard's coup d'état brought to a fever pitch. It all culminated in the Battle of Bosworth Field. It's a fantastic historical moment. The clash of a king with a dark reputation against an underdog claimant to the throne. Richard, ever the brave warrior, led a charge into the fray and was killed. His crown, the symbol of all his scheming and murder, was found in a bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. Talk about a dramatic end. So, while we can debate if he was a good person, there's no debating that his short and violent reign was terrible for the kingdom. It brought the Wars of the Roses to their final, bloody conclusion, but only by causing an enormous amount of political chaos. He was a king who was almost a caricature of a villain. A man who, if not for Shakespeare, might be seen in a different light today. But as it stands, his legacy is one of a crooked king. A man who paid the ultimate price for his ruthless ambition. It makes you almost feel sorry for him. Almost. Now, settle in. The sound of rain on the window pane is a gentle rhythm as we travel from the grey skies of medieval England to something a little more unhinged. You're walking a cobbled street, the air heavy with the scent of damp wool and burning peat. The world around you feels familiar, the social hierarchies, the constant struggle for power, but the personalities on the throne were sometimes, well, let's just say some of them had a few loose screws. This brings us to a crucial point. A terrible medieval king wasn't always a bad person. Sometimes, they were just completely, frighteningly, out of their mind. Let's do a little time warp. You know the name Caligula. right? The ancient Roman emperor who supposedly made his horse a senator and committed all kinds of depraved acts. Historians still argue whether his acts were true or later exaggerations. Well, the terrifying thing is that medieval Europe had its own versions of Caligula. While medieval rulers didn't make their horses senators, they often mirrored the capricious, cruel, and often bizarre behavior of their ancient Roman counterparts. This is a mainstream historical fact that shows up over and over again, the cyclical nature of power and the madness that comes with it. Consider this. You're a courtier in the 14th century. You're at a royal banquet, and the king is holding court. He's listening to your advice. He seems reasonable, even charming, and then, without warning, he stands up and starts shouting at an imaginary enemy. He rips off his clothes and runs through the halls, convinced he is made of glass and will shatter if anyone touches him. This is the world of Charles VI of France, a king we'll get to in a bit. But it's an open scholarly debate whether his madness was a unique instance or an extreme manifestation of the same kind of unchecked power and inbreeding that led to mental instability in the Roman emperors. It's a fun, if terrifying, parallel. It's easy to look back and think, oh, those were ancient times, surely we've advanced, but you'd be surprised. There's a fringe historical tidbit about Henry VI's mental illness that shows how superstition and fear were often more powerful than reason. During one of his catatonic states, his doctors, having exhausted all their medical remedies, tried a truly bizarre cure. They had him lie on the floor and had various nobles and clergy walk over him, believing that the purifying presence of holy men and women would cure his ailment. It didn't work, of course, but it shows the desperation of the era. So why bring up a Roman emperor in a medieval history script? Because it sets the stage for the kind of terrible we're about to explore, the kind that isn't motivated by political ambition or greed, but by a profound mental break. This is the kind of king who is a danger to himself and to everyone around him. Not because he's a schemer like Richard III, but because he's a walking catastrophe waiting to happen. It's like having the most powerful person in the country suddenly lose their connection to reality. The entire kingdom holds its breath, waiting for the next outburst, the next act of bizarre cruelty, or the next long, silent absence. Imagine being a courtier. Trying to navigate this, you have to be an amateur psychologist, a political strategist, and a world-class actor all at once. You have to smile and nod when the king tells you he's a different person today. You have to pretend not to notice when he banishes his closest advisors on a whim. The constant tension, the fear of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, would be utterly exhausting, and the kingdom itself would be at a standstill. All major decisions would be put on hold, and the power of the central government would slowly begin to unravel. It's a slow-motion disaster, and it's almost more terrifying than a quick, decisive civil war. It's the terrible of decay and uncertainty. So you're standing in a court that's teetering on the edge of chaos, where the king might or might not be there today. Now, let's leave the damp castles of Western Europe and travel east, where the air is colder and the history is written in blood and fire. Our journey takes us to the vast, unforgiving lands of Russia, to the court of a man whose name has become synonymous with terror. Imagine yourself not as a peasant or a courtier, but as a boyar, a Russian noble. The snow crunches under your boots, and the bitter wind stings your cheeks. You're summoned to the Kremlin, and your stomach is in knots. You never know if you're going to a feast or to your own execution. This is the world of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV, born in the early 16th century, was a true enigma. His reign was a bizarre mix of piety and profound cruelty. Historians still argue whether his erratic behavior was a result of a genuinely disturbed mind or a calculated political strategy to consolidate power. This is the central scholarly debate that defines his legacy. He was, by all accounts, highly intelligent and deeply religious. He loved to read, wrote beautiful poetry, and was obsessed with the idea of a divinely ordained monarchy. But he was also a man who would fly into a rage at a moment's notice. A man who saw traitors everywhere. A great mainstream historical fact is that Ivan was the first ruler to be officially crowned Tsar of all Russia. This was a huge deal. A way of asserting his absolute authority and separating himself from the local princes and boyars who had long been the real power in the land. He was a master of grand gestures. And this one was a big one. He was determined to make his mark, to create a new Russia, and he would stop at nothing to do it. And he certainly didn't stop at anything. The most famous and terrifying example of his cruelty was the creation of the Oprichnina. This was a state within a state, a territory ruled directly by Ivan and overseen by a band of black-clad, loyal enforcers called the Oprichniki. You can just picture them, riding through the villages, dressed in black and carrying a broom and a dog's head on their saddles, symbolizing their mission to sweep away treason and sniff it out like dogs. This is a fringe historical tidbit that's almost too bizarre to be true. But it was. The Oprichniki were given free rein to confiscate land, murder, and torture anyone they deemed disloyal. It was an institutionalized reign of terror. Imagine being a boyar, and the Oprichniki show up at your door. There's no due process, no trial. You just know that your life, your family, and your lands are now at the mercy of the Tsar's whim. This was Ivan's twisted mercy. He would often offer his victims a choice between two horrific deaths. Or sometimes he'd spare them only to bring them back a week later for another round of torture. His unpredictable nature was his most powerful weapon. It's almost more effective than a predictable tyrant. A predictable tyrant you can plan against, an unpredictable one you can only fear. His cruelty knew no bounds. He supposedly had one of his most trusted advisors, Prince Ivan Viskovity, boiled alive. He also killed his own son, Ivan, in a fit of rage, an act he deeply regretted for the rest of his life. The story goes he beat his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry, and when his son confronted him, he struck him on the head with his scepter. This final, terrible act, the murder of his own heir, left the kingdom in a state of crisis and is a horrifying testament to his madness. So, why is he on our list? Not just because of his cruelty, but because his reign was a masterclass in how a king's personal demons can become a national catastrophe. He consolidated power, yes, but he did it by destroying the very fabric of Russian society. He created a legacy of fear and paranoia that would define the country for centuries. Ivan the Terrible was a truly terrible king, a man who built a nation on a foundation of bone and blood, all while believing he was doing God's work. The echoes of Ivan's terror still linger, a chilling whisper across the vast Russian steppe. You can almost feel it, the tension, the fear, the absolute uncertainty of life under a capricious and brutal ruler. Now, let's leave the cold of Russia and travel to a place where the mountains are high and the forests are dark and ancient. To the lands of Wallachia in the 15th century. Here, we encounter a man whose name has become a household word, a figure of pure Gothic horror. You are a noble, or maybe a merchant, traveling through this land, and you can't shake the feeling that you are being watched. The trees seem to be whispering secrets, and the air is heavy with a sense of dread. This is the realm of Vlad the Impaler. Vlad III, a prince of Wallachia, is not just some obscure historical figure. He is, of course, the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. The name Dracula itself comes from the Romanian word for dragon's son, a title Vlad inherited from his father, who was a member of the Order of the Dragon. The mainstream historical fact is that Vlad was a real person, a ruler who fought against the encroaching Ottoman Empire and the local boyars who challenged his authority. But why is he on our list? Because his methods were not just cruel, they were a form of psychological warfare. His preferred method of execution was impalement. Yes, exactly what it sounds like. He would have his enemies, traitors, and even common criminals, skewered on a long, sharpened stake and left to die a slow, agonizing death. The stakes were often arranged in various heights, with the tallest reserved for the most important victims, creating a sort of macabre forest of human suffering. It's a grisly thought, but it was a deliberate tactic to instill terror. Imagine the sight of this. You're approaching a town, and in the distance, you see a grove of stakes, each with a person on it. It's a horrifying image, a brutal statement that says, "This is what happens to those who defy me." This is a fringe historical tidbit that perfectly illustrates his reputation. A Turkish chronicler wrote of an army approaching one of Vlad's towns and finding a forest of 20,000 impaled bodies outside the gates. The sight was so stomach-turning that the Sultan's army reportedly turned back, not wanting to fight a man so completely and utterly ruthless. Historians still argue whether this number is accurate or an exaggeration. But the story itself shows the sheer terror Vlad inspired. Vlad was a master of using fear as a tool of statecraft. He believed that the only way to rule a chaotic, divided land was with an iron fist. He saw himself as a righteous ruler, a man of God who was cleansing his land of traitors and infidels. This is where the open scholarly debate comes in. Was he a patriot, a necessary evil who used extreme cruelty to defend his homeland? Or was he a sadist, a man who just enjoyed inflicting pain? There is no easy answer. His actions were undoubtedly brutal, but they were also, in a strange way, effective. He brought a kind of harsh order to a chaotic land. His cruelty wasn't reserved for foreigners. He was just as brutal with his own people. A story often told is that he once held a banquet for his nobles. He asked them how many rulers they had served under. And when they answered, he had them all impaled because he saw their long service as a sign of disloyalty and treachery. It was a clear and bloody message. Loyalty to him was the only loyalty that mattered. He wasn't like King John, who was merely greedy and incompetent. Vlad was a man who used a focused, terrifying cruelty as a tool of governance. He was a terrible king not because he failed to rule, but because he succeeded in the most monstrous way imaginable. You can almost feel the chill of Vlad's forest of stakes in the air. A testament to how utterly ruthless a king could be. Now, let's leave the grim forests of Wallachia behind and head to the sunny, but equally dark, lands of Spain in the late 15th century. The air is warmer here, but the atmosphere is just as tense, filled with religious zeal and the ever-present threat of the Inquisition. Imagine yourself a scholar, or a merchant, living in a bustling city like Granada. You are of Jewish or Muslim faith, and you have lived here for generations. But now, a new decree has made your life a waking nightmare. This is the world of Queen Isabella of Castile. Isabella is a figure who, like many on this list, is seen differently depending on who you ask. To some, she is a hero, the monarch who united Spain and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. This is the great mainstream historical fact that defines her legacy for many people. She was a strong, capable ruler, a woman who wielded power in a man's world and changed the course of global history. She and her husband, Ferdinand II of Aragon, are seen as the founders of modern Spain. But for our purposes, she is a terrible ruler for a very specific reason: her uncompromising religious zeal. This is an open scholarly debate. Was she a devout monarch seeking to purify her kingdom? Or was she a ruthless politician using religion as a tool to consolidate power? The answer, as always, is probably a complicated mix of both. What is undeniable is the terrible impact of her actions on hundreds of thousands of people. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, act of her reign was the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. This wasn't just a simple court, it was a state-sponsored campaign of religious persecution designed to root out heresy. The inquisitors were given immense power to torture and imprison people, often on the basis of flimsy evidence or anonymous accusations. Imagine the fear of being denounced by a neighbor for a seemingly innocent act, like lighting candles on a Friday evening, and being dragged away to a dungeon to confess to being a secret Jew. This was the reality for thousands of people. And then came the big one, the Alhambra Decree of 1492. A fringe historical tidbit that highlights the cruelty of this decree is that Jewish families were only given a few months to either convert to Catholicism or leave the country forever. They were forbidden from taking any gold, silver, or other valuables with them, which meant they had to sell their homes and businesses for a pittance. Many were forced to trade their property for easily transportable goods like bolts of cloth or spices. You can just picture a family of scholars and merchants leaving their ancestral home, their entire life's work, for a handful of pepper. It was a complete and utter catastrophe for the Jewish community of Spain. The same fate was later forced upon the Muslims of Spain. They were given a similar choice: convert or be expelled. The loss of these communities, Jewish and Muslim, was an economic and cultural disaster for Spain. These were often the most educated and commercially successful members of society. Their expulsion led to a massive brain drain and a huge loss of wealth and talent. So, while she brought stability and unity to Spain and opened up a new world of exploration, she did it at an enormous cost to her own people. She was a terrible queen not because she was a failure, but because she was a success in her own frighteningly zealous way. She used the power of the throne to enforce a single-minded religious conformity. And in doing so, she created a legacy of intolerance and suffering that would haunt Spain for centuries. Her reign is a stark reminder that a ruler can be powerful and effective and still be utterly terrible. The shadow of Queen Isabella's Inquisition stretches across the Spanish landscape, a testament to how religious fanaticism could become an instrument of state terror. Now, let's travel north again, back to France in the same century, where the cruelty isn't driven by a specific ideology, but by a profound personal tragedy. You're a noble in the French court, and the air is thick with whispers. The king, your king, is acting strangely. He's not tyrannical like Vlad, not an absent leader like Henry VI. No, he's a different kind of terrible. He's a monarch unraveling before your very eyes. This is the story of Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad. Charles VI inherited the throne at the tender age of 11. He was known as Charles the Beloved, a young, promising king who was expected to bring glory to France. And for a while, he did. He was a capable ruler, a man who seemed to have a good head on his shoulders. But then, in 1392, something changed. He was riding with his knights through a forest when a man, dressed as a beggar, grabbed his horse's bridle and shouted a warning. The man was driven away, but the incident deeply unsettled the king. That same day, a page dropped a spear, and the clatter was enough to send Charles into a violent, paranoid frenzy. He drew his sword and began to attack his own men, killing several of them before he was finally subdued. This was the beginning of his mental decline. The mainstream historical fact is that Charles VI suffered from recurring bouts of psychosis. He would go through periods of complete delusion and violent outbursts, followed by long periods of lucidity and regret. It was a terrifying cycle for everyone around him. One of the most famous and bizarre episodes of his madness was the Bal des Ardents, or Ball of the Burning Men. This is a fringe historical tidbit that perfectly illustrates the sheer strangeness of his condition. Charles and 5 of his courtiers, dressed as wild men in costumes soaked in resin, performed a dance. A torch, brought too close by one of the onlookers, ignited the costumes. 4 of the men burned to death, and Charles was only saved when his aunt, the Duchess of Berry, covered him with her dress. He emerged from the flames physically unharmed but emotionally and mentally scarred. And his periods of lucidity became less frequent. Imagine being in the court after this incident. You just watched your king, who you now know is not entirely in his right mind, nearly burned to death. The incident would have been a massive blow to the monarchy's legitimacy. How can you trust a ruler who is so profoundly disconnected from reality? The French people were losing faith, and the nobles, always ready to seize an opportunity, saw their chance. The most profound impact of his madness was the political vacuum it created. With the king unable to rule effectively, a vicious power struggle erupted between his younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, and his uncle, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. This is the open scholarly debate that surrounds his reign. Was Charles's madness the sole cause of the civil war that followed? Or was it simply the catalyst that unleashed long-simmering rivalries between the powerful houses of Orléans and Burgundy? The result, of course, was a disastrous civil war that would lead to France's near collapse. The conflict between the two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, was brutal and unending. It left France vulnerable to its old enemy, England, which used the opportunity to invade. The English king, Henry V, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Agincourt. A battle that was only possible because France was so weakened by its own internal strife. Charles VI's reign is a tragic example of how a king's personal suffering can become a national disaster. He was a terrible king not because he was cruel or tyrannical, but because he was simply incapable of ruling. His madness, a personal affliction, was the match that lit the fuse of a century of war and destruction. The specter of Charles VI's madness hangs over France, a ghostly reminder of how a king's personal demons can become a nation's curse. Now, let's go back to England, where we find another king who was also a victim of his own inability to rule. Though for very different reasons. You're a powerful lord in the early 14th century, a man of wealth and influence. You're used to kings who are fierce warriors or cunning politicians. But the king on the throne now is, well, he's not what you'd expect. He's more interested in poetry and drama than in politics and war. This is the world of Edward II. Edward II was the son of a great king. Edward I, a ruthless and effective ruler known as Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots. You can just imagine the expectations placed on his young shoulders. He was supposed to be the next great warrior king. But Edward II was not his father. He was a man with a different kind of terrible. He was terrible because of his profound disinterest in the duties of a monarch and his overwhelming preference for his favorites. The mainstream historical fact about Edward II is that his reign was a disaster. He was a disastrous military commander, losing a decisive battle against the Scots at Bannockburn, a humiliation for England that would define his reign. But the real problem wasn't his lack of military skill. It was his obsession with his friends. You see, a king's court is a delicate balance of power. And every powerful lord has their place. Edward II completely upset this balance by showering his favorites with titles, lands, and power, alienating the old nobility. His most famous favorite was a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, whom he made Earl of Cornwall. This is a fringe historical tidbit that really shows the absurdity of the situation. Edward's love for Gaveston was so intense that he reportedly called him by nicknames like, "My sweetheart," and "My own beloved Piers." The nobles were furious, not because of the nature of the relationship, which historians still argue about, that's an open scholarly debate, but because Gaveston was seen as an upstart who was given power he hadn't earned. Imagine you're a powerful earl. Your family has served the crown for centuries. And now this foreigner, this Gaveston, has the king's ear. He's making fun of you and your friends, calling them nicknames like, the Black Dog of Arden. You'd be livid. The barons repeatedly exiled Gaveston, and each time, Edward brought him back, making him even more powerful. It was like a king-sized game of, I'm not listening. The nobles' patience finally ran out. They captured Gaveston and executed him, a shocking act of defiance against the crown. But Edward, instead of learning his lesson, simply replaced Gaveston with a new favorite, a man named Hugh Despenser the Younger. The cycle of favoritism, resentment, and political chaos began all over again. Edward II's reign is a perfect example of a king who failed not through malice or madness, but through sheer incompetence and emotional immaturity. He could not, or would not, understand the political realities of his time. He was too weak to control his own desires and too stubborn to listen to the powerful men who were trying to save his kingdom. His reign was a long, slow-motion unraveling of the English government. It all culminated in his deposition. His queen, Isabella, who was fed up with her husband and his favorite, fled to France and gathered an army. She returned to England, and the barons, sensing their opportunity, rallied behind her. Edward's favorite, Despenser, was brutally executed, and Edward himself was captured and imprisoned. The end of his life is one of the most famous and gruesome stories in all of English history. He was reportedly murdered in Berkeley Castle. A terrible end for a king who, in many ways, was a victim of his own personality. His reign is a testament to the fact that a terrible king doesn't have to be a monster. Sometimes, they can just be an ineffective, weak, and stubborn man who simply cannot fulfill the duties of his office. The fall of Edward II is a cautionary tale, a brutal lesson in what happens when a king's personal life becomes a national crisis. Now, let's travel to a different corner of Europe and a different kind of king. This time, he's not terrible because of his weakness or his cruelty, but because of his immense and misguided piety. You're in 13th century France, and the air smells of incense and ambition. The king on the throne is a man of deep faith, a man who sees himself not just as a ruler of men, but as a servant of God. This is Louis IX of France, a king so pious he was eventually canonized as St. Louis. You might be thinking, wait, a saint? How can a saint be a terrible king? Well, settle in. His story is a masterclass in how a ruler's virtue, taken to an extreme, can become a national disaster. The mainstream historical fact about Louis IX is that he was a very good king at home. He was a fair judge, a patron of the arts, and a man who cared deeply for the poor. He was known for holding court under an oak tree in the forest of Vincennes, where he would listen to the complaints of his subjects, rich and poor, and deliver justice himself. He was, by all accounts, a model monarch in France. But his piety was a double-edged sword. It led him to focus his energy on a cause that was, for France, a complete and utter folly: the Crusades. The first crusade he led was the Seventh Crusade, a massive military expedition to the Holy Land. He was so convinced of his divine mission that he spent an enormous amount of money and resources on it, much to the chagrin of his nobles and advisors. The campaign was an unmitigated disaster. The French army was decimated by disease and a lack of supplies. And Louis himself was captured by the Egyptians. He had to pay an enormous ransom to secure his release and the release of his surviving troops. Imagine being a French peasant, your son conscripted into the army, your taxes raised to pay for a war thousands of miles away. The news comes back that the king, your pious, beloved king, has been captured. It would be a blow to both your faith and your trust in the monarchy. This is a fringe historical tidbit that really shows the absurdity of the situation. After his release, Louis actually stayed in the Holy Land for 4 more years, a huge political liability, trying to negotiate for the release of other prisoners and fortifying the remaining Christian outposts. His heart was in the right place, but his head was not. Louis's story raises a profound and open scholarly debate. Can a king who is a good person be a bad ruler? Was his saintly devotion a form of political recklessness? He certainly left France in a weakened state. The financial drain of his crusades was immense, and the loss of so many men in a foreign land was a huge blow to the kingdom. He was a king who was so focused on the salvation of his soul that he neglected the stability of his kingdom. And he didn't learn his lesson. He launched a second crusade, the Eighth Crusade, a few years later. This time, he set his sights on Tunis. The campaign was another disaster. Disease swept through his army, and Louis himself died of dysentery. A terrible end for a man who had dedicated his life to a holy cause. His death was a complete and utter failure, and his kingdom was left without a leader. So, while he was a moral and just man, Louis IX was a terrible king. He was a kind of antithesis to our other bad kings. He wasn't cruel like Ivan the Terrible or a weak puppet like Edward II. He was a king who was too good, too pious, too obsessed with an impossible dream. His reign is a testament to the fact that a king's personal beliefs, no matter how noble, can be utterly ruinous if they lead to a neglect of his primary duty, to govern his people with wisdom and prudence. His legacy is a complex one, a saint who, in his quest for salvation, left a legacy of death and political instability. So, our pious, saintly king has died in a foreign land, a victim of his own unwavering faith. We've seen cruelty, madness, and pious folly. Now, let's go back to England, to the 11th century, a time of upheaval and transition. You're a Saxon thane, a loyal noble, and you've just sworn allegiance to a new king, a man who has risen from the ranks of the most powerful lords to seize the crown. This is Harold Godwinson, and his reign is the definition of a beautiful, brief, and utterly doomed moment in history. Harold Godwinson was not born a king. He was the most powerful earl in England, a great warrior, and a man who had served his king, Edward the Confessor, faithfully for decades. When Edward died without a clear heir, Harold was the logical choice. The mainstream historical fact is that he was crowned king just 1 day after Edward's death. This was a move of necessity and speed, designed to prevent a power vacuum and to secure the throne against a number of ambitious rivals. He was a good man, a capable leader, and a man who, by all accounts, had the best interests of his people at heart. But he was a terrible king for a single, terrible reason. He was caught between 3 powerful rivals, and he simply could not defeat them all. The first challenger was his own brother, Tostig, who had been exiled and was seeking revenge. The second was Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, a fierce warrior who believed he had a claim to the English throne. The third, and most famous, was William, Duke of Normandy, who believed he had been promised the throne by Edward the Confessor. Imagine yourself a soldier in Harold's army. You've just heard the news that a Viking army has landed in the north. You and your king, Harold, march all the way to Yorkshire. A grueling, week-long trek, and you fight a bloody battle at Stamford Bridge. You win. It's a glorious victory. You've defeated one of the most feared warriors in Europe. But then, just a few days later, You get the news. William has landed in the south. There's no time to rest. No time to celebrate. You have to turn around and march all the way back. A brutal, bone-wearying journey that will decide the fate of your country. This is a fringe historical tidbit that shows the sheer physical toll of Harold's reign. He marched his army over 200 miles in less than a week. A staggering feat of endurance. But it came at a terrible price. His army was exhausted, depleted, and in no condition to fight another major battle. When they finally met William's army at Hastings, they were at a severe disadvantage. The battle, of course, was a disaster. Harold was killed, and the Normans took over the country. Harold's story raises an open scholarly debate. Was he a good king who was simply a victim of impossible circumstances? Or was he a bad king because he took a throne he couldn't hold? Some historians argue that he should have waited for William to make his move before engaging the Vikings. Others say he had no choice. But the fact remains that his short, glorious, but ultimately disastrous reign led to the conquest of England. So, while he was a man of great courage and integrity, Harold Godwinson was a terrible king. He was a king who, in his valiant but ultimately futile effort to defend his crown, lost it all and changed the course of English history forever. His reign is a testament to the fact that sometimes, even a good man can be a terrible king if the circumstances are simply stacked against him. He was a king who was not a failure in his character, but in his destiny. The story of Harold Godwinson is a powerful reminder that destiny can be a brutal master, and a good man can still be a terrible king. Now, let's go back in time, to the chaotic 12th century. A period in England that was so violent and unpredictable it was simply known as the anarchy. You're a peasant farmer. Your land is ruined, and your village has been burned to the ground. You have no idea who your ruler is. Is it the king? Or is it his cousin, the empress? This is the world of King Stephen. Stephen of Blois was a popular and charismatic man, a nephew of King Henry I. When Henry died, he left his throne to his daughter, Matilda, a formidable woman known as the Empress. But a woman on the throne was a radical idea for the time. And Stephen, being the popular choice of the nobles, seized the crown. He was a terrible king not because he was cruel or insane, but because he was a weak ruler who was simply unable to control the powerful barons who supported him. His reign is a textbook case of what happens when a king's authority is not respected. The mainstream historical fact is that King Stephen's reign was marked by a brutal civil war with the Empress Matilda that lasted for nearly 20 years. This conflict plunged England into a state of utter chaos. The country was divided, and the barons, seeing the weakness of the central government, began to act as kings in their own right. They built their own castles, raised their own armies, and plundered the land with impunity. Imagine the situation. You are a commoner, and you see your crops being trampled by a lord's army. You can't appeal to the king because he's too busy fighting his cousin. The local baron, who is supposed to protect you, is more interested in fighting his neighbor. The law has broken down completely. The contemporary account, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, called this time the anarchy and wrote that Christ and his saints were asleep. It's an open scholarly debate whether Stephen was simply too gentle or too indecisive to be an effective ruler. But the result was the same, a complete breakdown of law and order. A fringe historical tidbit that perfectly captures the chaos of this period is the sheer number of adulterine, or unlicensed castles that were built. Barons were building their own private fortresses, which they used as bases for plundering and terrorizing the countryside. Stephen, in his weakness, was unable to stop them. He would capture one and destroy it, only for two more to pop up somewhere else. The kingdom was crumbling into a series of lawless, private fiefdoms. Stephen's reign is a testament to the fact that a king's primary duty is to keep the peace. His failure to do so, a failure that was born more out of a lack of political skill than out of malice, led to a period of widespread suffering and devastation. He was a king who was, for all his good intentions, completely ill-equipped to handle the immense political and military challenges of his time. He was a king of goodwill who was a complete failure at the very thing he was meant to do. The people of England suffered terribly for his weakness, and he left a legacy of chaos that would take his successor, Henry II, years to fix. So, while he was not a monster like Vlad the Impaler or a madman like Charles VI. Stephen was a terrible king. He was a king who, in his weakness, created a vacuum that swallowed his kingdom whole. He was a king who was not a tyrant, but a victim of his own circumstances. A man who, in his inability to rule, unleashed a period of terror on his own people. The chaos of the anarchy leaves us in a state of unease. A reminder that the failure of a king to assert his authority can be a form of terrible rule in and of itself. Now, let's travel to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. A sprawling, decentralized collection of states in Central Europe. The year is the late 11th century. And the king is a man who believes his power is given to him directly by God. A man who is a complete and utter foil to the religious zeal of Louis IX. This is Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. And his reign is defined by a single, seismic conflict. Henry was a powerful and ambitious ruler. He believed that, as emperor, he had the right to appoint bishops and abbots within his realm. This was a long-standing tradition known as lay investiture. But the Pope at the time, Gregory VII, had a very different idea. He believed that the Church, and the Church alone, had the right to appoint its own clergy. This is the great mainstream historical fact that defines this period. The investiture controversy. A long and bitter struggle for power between the secular authority of the emperor and the spiritual authority of the pope. Imagine you are a bishop in the Holy Roman Empire. You are a powerful lord, with lands, serfs, and armies. For centuries, you have been loyal to the emperor who gave you your office. But now, the pope is telling you that the emperor has no authority over you. You are caught in the middle of a titanic struggle. And you have to choose a side. This is an open scholarly debate. Was Henry IV a terrible king because he was arrogant and stubborn? Or was Pope Gregory VII a terrible pope because he was so rigid in his quest for papal supremacy? The conflict was a disaster for the Holy Roman Empire, which was torn apart by civil war and rebellions. Henry was a terrible king because he was unable to compromise. His single-minded pursuit of power led him to excommunicate the pope. And the Pope, in turn, excommunicated him. This was a huge deal in medieval Europe. It meant that Henry was, in the eyes of the Church, no longer a legitimate ruler. His subjects were released from their oaths of loyalty. And the German princes, always ready to seize an opportunity to diminish the emperor's power, revolted. The most famous, and most humiliating, moment of his reign was his trip to Canossa. Henry, stripped of all his authority, was forced to travel to a castle in Italy where the Pope was staying. He had to stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days, dressed in a penitent's clothes, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. This is a fringe historical tidbit that shows just how far the emperor had fallen. He was, for all intents and purposes, a defeated king, a man whose arrogance had led to his complete and utter humiliation. Even after being forgiven, Henry's problems didn't go away. The war with the German princes continued, and the conflict with the papacy would last for the rest of his life and beyond. He would eventually take his revenge on the Pope, but his reign was one of constant strife and rebellion. He was a king who was, in his single-mindedness, a complete and utter failure at the most important part of his job, keeping the peace. He left a legacy of a weakened empire, a rebellious nobility, and a long-standing conflict between church and state. So, while he was a man of immense power, Henry IV was a terrible king. He was a king who, in his blind ambition, created a civil war that tore his kingdom apart. He was a king who, in his quest for absolute power, lost it all and left a legacy of a country that was weaker and more divided than when he found it. The ghost of Henry IV's pride still haunts the Holy Roman Empire. A reminder that the clash of church and state could be just as devastating as any civil war. Now, let's travel south, to the sun-drenched, but equally dark, lands of Naples in the 15th century. Here we meet a king who, in his paranoia and cruelty, embodies all the worst traits of a terrible ruler. You're a noble in the court of King Ferdinand I of Naples, and you live in a state of constant, stomach-churning fear. You never know if the king will be your patron or your executioner. Ferdinand I, also known as Ferrante, was a king who had to fight for his throne, and in doing so, he developed a profound sense of paranoia. The mainstream historical fact about his reign is that he was a master of political intrigue. A cunning and ruthless ruler who managed to consolidate his power and maintain control over his kingdom despite numerous conspiracies and rebellions. He was, in a very twisted way, a successful king, but his success came at a terrifying price. He was a tyrant in the truest sense of the word. He would invite his enemies, the rebellious barons who had dared to challenge him, to a great banquet, offering them friendship and forgiveness. But then, at the end of the feast, he would have them all arrested and imprisoned. The trust he built was a deliberate, cynical tool to lure his enemies into a trap. This is an open scholarly debate. Was his cruelty a necessary evil to maintain a stable kingdom? Or was it a sign of a truly disturbed mind? A fringe historical tidbit that perfectly illustrates his cruelty is the Black Museum he kept. Ferdinand was so paranoid and vengeful that he would have his enemies' mummified bodies, dressed in their clothes, placed in a room in his castle. He would reportedly visit them, talk to them, and sometimes even touch them. A bizarre and chilling ritual that showed his utter contempt for his enemies. Imagine being a foreign dignitary, visiting the king's court, and being shown this room of mummified corpses. It would be a stark and terrifying warning. Ferdinand was a master of using fear as a tool of statecraft. His cruelty was not just random. It was a deliberate strategy to keep his nobles in a state of constant terror. He made an example of anyone who dared to challenge his authority. And in doing so, he created a state where no one could trust anyone. The nobles were so afraid of him that they were constantly trying to flee or to conspire against him. Which of course, only reinforced his paranoia. His reign is a perfect example of how a king who is a political success can be a moral and human failure. He brought a kind of harsh stability to his kingdom, but he did it by creating a state where there was no justice, no mercy, and no trust. He was a king who was, for all his political cunning, a walking, breathing nightmare. His legacy is one of a king who, in his quest to secure his throne, became a monster. He was a king who, in his paranoia, created the very conspiracies he was so afraid of. So, while he was not a madman like Charles VI or a victim of circumstance like Harold Godwinson, Ferdinand I was a truly terrible king. He was a king who, in his calculated cruelty, created a kingdom of fear. He was a king who was not just a tyrant but a walking monument to the depths of human cruelty. The reign of Ferdinand I of Naples, a man who collected the mummified bodies of his enemies, brings our journey to a close. We've traversed centuries and continents, from the fields of Runnymede to the forests of Wallachia, from the Russian steppes to the sun-drenched coasts of Spain. We've seen kings who were terrible for a host of reasons, for their greed, their madness, their weakness, their piety, and their profound and terrifying cruelty. We've seen how a king's personal flaws, no matter how small, can become a national catastrophe. So, as you lie here, safe and sound, think about this. Why do we judge them? Why do we, centuries later, still talk about the terrible kings of medieval history? It's an open scholarly debate. Are we judging them by our own modern standards of human rights and democracy? Standards that they could never have understood? Or are we, in some small way, trying to find a pattern, a lesson in their failures? We judge them not just on their actions, but on the lasting impact of their reigns. We judge King John not just for his taxes, but for the Magna Carta that his greed made necessary. We judge Henry VI not just for his madness, but for the Wars of the Roses that his absence ignited. We judge Vlad the Impaler not just for his cruelty, but for the legacy of terror that he used to defend his homeland. The great mainstream historical fact is that these kings, for all their terrible flaws, shaped the world we live in today. The laws that limit our governments, the wars that shaped our nations, the cultural and religious conflicts that still echo in our modern world. We're all, in some way, influenced by these men and women. Their terrible reigns were, in a very real sense, a crucible in which our modern world was forged. It's a fringe historical tidbit that the very term, tyrant, came to be redefined during the medieval period. Shifting from a ruler who seized power to a ruler who used power without justice. We see this in the stories we've heard tonight. A gradual shift in the understanding of what it means to be a truly terrible king. It's not just about seizing the throne, but about what you do with it. We've come to the end of our journey now. The stories of these terrible kings are a reminder that power, in the wrong hands, is a dangerous thing, but they are also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. For every terrible king, there were people who endured, who resisted, and who, in their quiet way, found a way to survive. The memory of their suffering is a kind of gentle, sleepy lullaby. The night is quiet now. The shadows are long and soft. The kings, with all their fury and their folly, are gone. Their crowns are dust, and their castles are crumbling ruins. All that is left are their stories. Stories that have, in a strange way, made you just a little bit safer tonight. The sounds of the world are fading. The distant hum of the fan. The soft rustle of the sheets. The air is still. There is nothing to do now but to let go. You are safe. You are warm. And the ghosts of history are finally sleeping.